record. I don't know if that.
I think it's recording now.
It's recording. It's recording.
Oh, okay, yeah, it says it on mine too.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
So,
I see it. Okay.
Yeah. So, okay, we each have 8 minutes to like present our side. So, Layla, since your topic A, do you want to start? I don't know where Angel is.
Yeah.
Sorry, what did you say? I can't hear you.
Since your topic A, do you want to start? You have 8 minutes to present your
like
topic. Like topic A, we were
okay.
like we were the H factor, and you were the
mental health.
Yeah.
Okay.
You for 8 minutes.
Okay. So basically, for the mental health issue, there's this organization. It's for better mental health. They offer the stories of people that have suffered mental health issues, and they try to through these sharings for people to understand one another and to have these people feel like they are essentially being heard, and that people are really they're really being heard and understood. This website, for this organization, they also specify how these people that have mental health problems can agree to treatment, and what's the general rules, and just an overview. So a doctor will suggest certain kinds of treatments for a person, and in most situations they can't these mentally ill people, they can't really be treated unless they agree, but they can have a lot of issue around that because they are their mental health may affect their decisions. So they need a patient who's voluntary, a patient who has at least a guardian or someone who can aid them through their decision, because they can't make it all on their own. And it's also there's something called psychiatric care and consent. So that's more focused on it's aimed at physicians. There was a link providing a journal article, a peer-reviewed article on this. It just shows it needs your psychiatrist needs to give you as much information as possible, especially people who are mentally ill, in order to because by definition people with mental disorders do not always tend to have diminished cognitive function, and they always have poor judgments, and they can't really make they don't really have consent. It's really impaired. So these people, their psychiatrists, their psychologists really need to aid them through, but not influence their decision. So less tell them what to do, more show them the different angles that the mental illness might block them from seeing, essentially. And that is mostly on the website of this organization, because they're trying to aid people with mental illnesses to understand their rights and how informed consent in their story goes. And then we have the article, which just tells you more about the psychiatrist's role there.
Okay, cool. Okay, so now Abby and I will go. Abby, do you want to start off since your slide is first?
Yeah. So we had the discussion about the age factor in deciding who gets the decision-making rights in cases with not necessarily the mentally ill, but just overall kind of the age factor, and whether minors and elderly get to decide for themselves whether they want treatment or some kind of procedure done on them. And so I researched the minors. So the first article talks about how minors are usually considered those who are 15 to 20 years old, and it kind of depends on what state you live in or the laws that are in that specific region. But those who are under the age are legally unable to consent to care for themselves. And underage girls, so one of the other article that talked about minors' role in this case would be underage girls are deemed too immature for abortions but mature enough for motherhood. So the article discussed a case about this girl who was 16 years old, and she wanted an abortion, but when she took her case to court, she was deemed too immature for an abortion, but they considered motherhood being a viable option for her, which she thought was not fair because the two didn't really correlate. So she felt that if herself, she thought she wasn't ready for motherhood, so that's why she wanted the abortion. But the courts are saying the exact opposite. And I think in the article, her parents were supporting her decision about it, but when they had gone to have the abortion, then the law came into play with where she wasn't able to make the decision for herself. And then the second article talked about more of a general, like you said, Layla, it's just mainly like a top article discussing like the adolescent mental health care laws and how they work in each state. And it talked about a lot of the laws in Canada. So in Canada, they were saying some of the laws state that you have to be at least for the mental decision-making aspect of the like the laws in Canada state that at the age of 14, you're still not competent to make decisions for yourself. And those rights are passed on to parents or legal guardians. And there's also this thing called capacity, and you have to have the mental capacity for consent, which plays into the mentally ill side of the argument with topic A. So, and there's all these different factors when deciding whether adolescents should have rights on abortions, for example, or any kind of other mental or physical treatment, or some kind of, if they have cancer, they can decide whether or not they want treatment for it, or if they would rather not for any reasons. So another fact that some of the articles talked about were that states have different laws about consent versus notification of the legal guardians. So some states require parental approval for consent to treatments, while others require that the guardians are simply notified that the treatment will take place. So this gives the minors a little more leeway in their decision, that they don't have to actually get specific permission from their parents. They only have to notify them that this is what's happening, and that's the procedure they'll be going with. And then maturity comes into play a lot with these cases, because some minors who are 13 or 14, for example, may be more mature than those who are 18 to 20. And this happens a lot with teenagers who are in broken homes, or if they are adopted, or if they're in a foster home. They are often a lot more mature for their age, and they believe they can make their own decisions since they have this maturity more than, say, for example, someone who's 18 who's lived in a sheltered home their whole lives, and they've had their parents backing them up. And there are also instances in times of emergency when physicians are legally allowed to operate without consent when necessary in order to save a patient's life. So this is a completely different aspect of consent. When it's emergency, they're able to do any procedures or any kind of like surgery where it would be pertinent to save the person's life. And then I think I made a note in here that adequate understanding is essential for these types of cases with minors, because if they are going to be given the rights to make decisions for themselves, they need to prove the maturity by comprehending all the information that their doctors are giving them, and they need to be able to understand what they're agreeing to. And that also goes along with maturity, because they need to be mature enough to understand these serious like consequences of surgery or treatments that they would be receiving if they were to decide to get treatment or surgery or abortion or something like that.
Since we're on the topic of minors already, do you want to just go through your thoughts, and then I'll do elderly and then my thoughts on elderly?
Sure, yeah. Okay, so basically after reading the two articles and all the other facts about the case, I said, for minors, although most minors are not mature enough to be the only ones making decisions regarding their health, I believe that they should have the ultimate decision. Parents and legal guardians should be a helping hand in guiding their children to the right decision, but should not be the only ones solely deciding the fate of another person. With these laws set in place, minors are free from coercion and are safe knowing that they truly made their own decision. This is significantly beneficial in the instances in which minors disagree with their parents' options on treatment, or if parents do not have the best interest of their child in mind. Although it is reassuring to think that all parents want the best for their children, we have to look out for the minors that are not so fortunate. If these laws were to be enacted, it would be essential for minors to receive adequate disclosure from their doctors and to have adequate understanding of their treatment options so they know fully what they are consenting to.
Okay, cool. And so then I read the articles on the elderly. and there wasn't really a set age they talked about, but they did a study on the elderly over age 65, and only 72% of those patients received information on the progress of their illness, while only 53% received information on the treatment itself. So a lot of times the doctors just like don't tell the elderly like what's going on or like what their treatment options are because they don't think they're capable of handling it, especially with patients with dementia or Alzheimer's. And so they kind of recommended that the doctors ask their patients, those patients with mental disorders, which kind of goes into what Layla was talking about, when they're like of sound mind, and like whatever they say when they're like not, when they're not being affected, or whatever they say while they're not being affected is what should be taken into consideration, not what they say while they are being affected by that mental illness. And there was something called a power of attorney, a POA. So that's a document in which someone else is named an agent for a patient, and that agent can act on behalf of his or her patient. And so the amount of power given to the POA just depends on how the document is drafted. And then it was saying in other countries like Spain, a person can choose whether or not to consent to medical treatment, no matter how rational or irrational that person's reasoning is. So there are a lot of different places where it really doesn't matter like their mental status or anything, like they can choose to consent or choose not to consent. And another factor was that a lot of like frail elderly people can be like fully competent most of the time, but then when it comes to like falling ill or like being in some kind of emergency situation, they panic and they're not able to fully comprehend the situation and like what repercussions there could be or like make like good decisions for themselves. So what I said was that I believe that the patient should be the one giving consent unless the patient has a POA or a living will that states otherwise. Because, oh, sorry. I'm just gonna keep going. Karina, I'm in the middle of something. Come back. I'm in the middle of a chat for my homework. Okay, that's fine. Sorry, my little sister. Okay. Okay, I said that I definitely think that the relatives of the elderly patient should also be informed of all the patient's medical information so that they can help guide the patient gently in the right direction if needed. So I'm not saying that they should be like a large influence factor on the elder, but like I feel like if the relatives know all the information, they'll be able to kind of, the trusting relationship between the elder and their relatives might like help the elder person make the right decision. If an elder patient does make a decision that will cause harm on themselves or worsen their situation, and then that decision should probably be like carefully considered before being implemented in accordance with beneficence and non-maleficence, because maybe they don't know or understand like the full effect of the decision they're making. But I don't think information should be withheld from a patient simply because of their age and possible inability to comprehend the situation, because an elderly patient deserves to know all of his or her medical information just as equally and thoroughly as any other patient. Okay, so now we have to discuss the distinction between assent and consent. So assent refers to getting approval from the patient who is unable to give full consent. While assent is not legally binding in any way, most healthcare providers are reluctant to provide care to any patient who has not at least given assent. What are your thoughts on the distinction? Does it seem arbitrary? Should assent ever be enough? Which class of controversial and consent persons, mentally ill, children, or the elderly, do you think this most applies to? Okay, so we also have to discuss these questions for 8 minutes.
Okay. Oh, go ahead.
No, I wasn't really going to say anything. You can go ahead.
I was just going to say, so for assent, I think that plays into topic B a lot because it says getting approval from the patient who's unable to give full consent. With minors and the elderly, if they have some kind of mental illness where they aren't able to make those decisions for themselves, or just the fact that they're older and they are not in a sound mind, or children who don't fully know the implications that they're agreeing to. It says it's not legally binding. So like these decisions that if they were going to be passed on to parents or some kind of proxy for the elderly, they would definitely have to be making a decision that they know that the old elderly person or the child would want, not just something that the parent thinks is right. It would have to be something that they would both agree on. So that's why I think it's kind of not unfair, but just kind of, it depends on the circumstances of the case. If a parent or proxy or legal guardian or whatever is deciding something for them, it's hard to get a clear knowledge of what the patient actually wants versus it might have some kind of different path for the person who is actually giving the consent for it.
Right.
So that for assent. And then, wait, where did it say consent or something like that?
Yeah, so we're trying to discuss the difference between assent and consent. So consent is, I guess, giving approval when they know everything and are like fully conscious and aware, and assent is when they're not able to give that.
Yeah, I think that's what it is.
Okay, so then I think that for elderly patients, then I think assent is okay as long as they like know the main part. Like I don't know, maybe someone either like I mean maybe someone who's like really young or really old won't be able to understand everything. There's just like no way you can like force them to understand everything.
Yeah.
If they give consent, knowing if they have like a, and you should be able to like know, like the doctor should be able to know like if this patient like knows like the basic information about what's going on with them, then I think that's good enough in most cases. If you can't like get a full understanding, then I think that should be good enough.
Yeah. But so in like the mentally ill, because I'm more focused on like topic A, I was thinking sometimes the doctor like or the person who's there really focuses on assent more because they want the best for their patients and they feel like the mental illness may be a barrier and it's not allowing this patient to fully understand like the procedure, what's going to happen or why this is happening. And so they have to like assent has to be enough because otherwise the medical care will not progress further than just like telling them what they want to do, because otherwise the patient might not understand. Like there are some mental illnesses that just provide barriers between them. For example, if we were to take a more neurological based illness, not like mental more like of a mental impairment, and we talk about like presence of like amnesia, for example, he has to keep on like repeating the procedure or what he's going to do. The patient might even forget giving consent or and that would revert them back to square one. So I think assent in some cases is really necessary, and because these mentally ill people, they can't always give you their consent. And I think if a mentally ill person was to give consent, that their psychiatrist must be there or someone who knows of their case and is usually unbiased and uninfluential, because we don't want them to have had like a huge influence on the patient. And I think that's the only time when the doctor can get consent, maybe because the mental illness allows for understanding, but otherwise it will only be limited to assent. And I think a good doctor, at least one that is like very bioethical and like understands the rules, will try their best to give the patient like their best.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that if we don't ever use assent, like sometimes nothing will get done. So to answer the question here, that's should assent ever be enough? I think sometimes it has to be enough because you can't always get full like proper consent. And then another question is, which class of controversial and consent persons do you think? So do you think this most applies to mentally ill people, children, or the elderly?
I would probably say mentally ill because if you're assuming that it's three different categories, like mentally ill, children, and elderly, that's assuming that the children and the elderly are able to comprehend more of the circumstances more than the mentally ill. So if any one person was needed, if like one group was needed to like be made decisions for, I think it would definitely be the mentally ill, because they like physically don't have the capacity to understand. Whereas like children and elderly, you could talk them through it and give them more of an understanding. Like even if they aren't ever going to fully understand what's happening or what the treatment options are and the consequences and benefits of them, you can sort of understand it, or you can give them an understanding in a way that you know that they're going to like comprehend that. Like you can talk to them in their language, like what they're going to understand specifically. So I would say mentally ill for that one.
Exactly. They can like understand to a degree to be enough like sort of consent. However, I think like the mentally ill, a lot of them cannot at all, and assent should be enough. And sometimes I think there should be like a third factor where it's like not even a basic understanding. It's just like the need for the medical team to make the decision, because sometimes this mentally ill person might like actually not be able to even give you assent because they don't understand the basis of what's happening. So I think that's why it applies most to them, because they need that leniency when it comes to the law.
Yeah. And then one of on the project where we had to find our own case analysis study, I researched one on a hospital psychiatric ward that was actually abusing their patients for not for consent, but just kind of for cooperation in putting them in rooms and stuff. And I was talking about how there definitely shouldn't be any kind of physical abuse because most mental patients aren't aware that they're being violent or doing something wrong. They're just, their brain like takes over. So they're not necessarily doing it to hurt someone. It just happens. So it would be great to think that all hospitals and like psychiatric wards are doing like making decisions based on the like what's going to be the best outcome for the patients. But there's also like the perspective to look at that maybe they don't have the best thing in mind. Maybe they're just doing this procedure to make money or doing it because they know it will benefit them somehow and not specifically for the patient. So that's another like factor to look at, that some people don't always have like the best interest in mind for the person who really does need the help.
Right. Okay, cool. So that's 8 minutes. Okay, the last thing we need to do is give each other feedback on the final project proposal. So I know that Angel I didn't see Angel's there.
Yeah.
Layla, we couldn't view yours. If you just like go to the share link, then you.
Oh, I just made it shareable. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm thinking about yours.
Okay.
So I put this in the comments as well. The question you asked, which is it ethically fair to provide human enhancement for select few because not everyone will be able to afford it? So I kind of, what did I say? I think I was like,
Let me see.
I thought that was a really good question, and then I was wondering like if we did only offer it to select few, like how would that affect the population? Like, you know, like in biology we looked at like artificial selection and evolution and stuff like that. So like would it result in like in the future there being a much stronger human population since like only a select few would have and those few would reproduce and then we just have like a completely like stronger human population, and like if that would happen, would it be worth it? Like I'm not saying it is, but I'm just asking.
Yeah, just the question of it.
Like, that would be kind of interesting to look at.
Yeah, and I like the two topics you chose. They were like, for me, I tried to choose them really close together, but yours were like more like they varied. You went from human based to animal based. So the one about like the animal research, and you thinking about like if it's ethical to even subject them to harm for medical research, I feel like you're gonna like, it's expected, but I was wondering how you would address like because it's really easy to debunk it. It's really easy to say like, what else are we gonna experiment on, and would you want us to experiment on like humans, and like that's absurd. So I feel like you would have to produce a counter argument and then counter your counter argument. So I was wondering how you would deal with that.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. I think there's definitely, you have to look at the side of like, if we don't test on animals, what are we going to test on? We need something to advance this study. Yeah. Okay, so I can do mine. For a positive, I said I really liked how you explained all the bioethical principles that are covered in each of your topics. And I thought that eugenics, I think that's how you say it, eugenics was a really interesting case. It's kind of like human enhancement in a way, because it's also like increasing the like proficiency and just kind of overall productivity of our population. And looking at it in a positive way, it would definitely help just kind of give like an extra boost to the population just in terms of technology and like what we can do with science now. And then for one negative, I said I would have liked a little more explanation on how eugenics could negatively affect an individual according to the principle of non-maleficence. And then I said, other than fairness and distribution to all, are there any risks with these procedures? Like, are there any potential threats that they could cause to their health, or anything that could possibly hurt them, like pertaining to non-maleficence? And then for what's next, I said, I think you're on a really good track with your research for both the sample topics. And I really liked your course of action where you said you would look for specific cases to gather their opinions. And it's a great idea. And one suggestion I would have would be, especially for abortion, since it's such a debated topic, make sure to point out all your reasons for both perspectives before coming to a conclusion, because this way you're not discrediting any viable perspectives by not researching them or like offending anyone or anything, just to make sure you have all the angles in there and then come up with your conclusion for it. And then for Layla, I would say, let me just read through this real quickly.
While you read through it, let me just
Oh, yeah, go
add
ahead.
my comment. So what I thought was, said like as positives, your notes were like, they were very, very thorough. They truly like reflected your thinking process, and they aided me in understanding the sources that you chose about your topics, because I just skimmed through the links you put on, but like I didn't read them as thoroughly as you would have. And the notes you provided were they helped me so much to understand your topic a bit more, and I thought that was really good. And then you went through each of the bioethical principles, just as Abby said, specifically, and you presented them each like according to the topic you chose. The one negative I said, and it wasn't even an actual negative, I said it was really good that you're focusing on like videos and reports to for your research as a resource. However, so in my school we take this course. I don't know if it's very widespread capstone. AP Capstone is basically how to research. So we have this list of websites that give you peer-reviewed articles, and peer-reviewed articles are always really good sources. So I think you could use JSTOR, EBSCOhost. These always have medical reports. They always have medical reports about like clinical trials, about the topics that we're essentially researching. And I thought that would be like really helpful, because it just provides a lot of research information, peer-reviewed, about the topics that you're dealing with.
Okay, I'm looking at yours on clinical versus compassionate doctors. I think it's really cool your like motivation to study this topic, because you want to be a doctor one day and you want to see like how this will affect you and what you want to do when you're a doctor. And then I like how you touched on all the principles like non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. Do you think autonomy? The doctor should choose to act, and the patient choose to act. Right. Okay. So yeah, no, I think that this is a really good topic. I think that it's not one that I've really like thought about before. Clinical versus compassionate. I think that would be really interesting.
And then mine for yours would be, I really liked how your 3 facts about the case for clinical versus compassionate doctors are really specific, and they give like a lot of variety and like within the case, like talking about the specifics of it. One negative would be for the information and resources. I would have liked to see what specifically you would be researching like in the internships in the local hospital, like what questions you would ask doctors or so. And then which also plays into my like what's next. I think it would be really cool if when you went to the hospital and you were interviewing doctors, you could talk about how their relationships with their patients like play into their decision making factors when they're deciding like, should this person get the best treatment, like if they're their favorite patient or whatever, like if they have some kind of way of deciding like who gets what kind of treatment or something, or if they kind of have this plan to not have any bias towards patients, and because I have heard that some doctors don't like forming relationships with their patients, because then they aren't attached to them if something bad were to happen, or if they were to pass away in surgery or anything, then they don't have that kind of attachment to them, which seems horrible, but I kind of understand it. Like if you have a billion patients, you don't want to be forming these relationships with them, and they possibly pass away one day, which is so sad, and then you are so involved with it and it affects you possibly every day. Like if a patient dies every day and you have a relationship with them, that's so much grief.
Exactly. And like a lot of doctors, if you actually have a really strong connection with the patient, you're not allowed to perform surgery.
Oh, really?
Because you're emotionally blocked. But I was thinking, because the hospital I'm going to, I chose it because I heard about this incident there where someone was like stabbed and like they had to deal with it, and then after the person died like in surgery, and they were taking him out, and the doctor that performed the surgery lifted it, and he was like, and he showed it to another doctor, and he was like, oh, another one. And I'm like, they're so unemotionally attached to like what is happening here, and I wanted to see that response.
Yeah, I think that'd be a great like different quotes you could get from them will be amazing. Like I feel like some people view that as like horrible, like how could they possibly not have feelings for these people, like if they're physically hurt or if they have some kind of like stab wound or something, and if they're like not fazed by it, it just passes right over their head. I think that's really interesting.
In some cases, like what I've heard, they'll say like you have to like be emotionally unattached otherwise, because if you emotionally attach yourself to everyone patient, you're just gonna be like depressed all the time.
Yeah.
Because there's so much like sadness.
Yeah.
That'd be really interesting. Okay, so we've hit 40 minutes. So
Okay.
I think we covered everything.
Yeah.
So,
Wait, let me see.
when you're the one recording this, are you the one that's gonna stop it?
I think. Wait, let me try.